Welcome everyone to this EBA webinar on the topic of democracy aid and its effects. My name is Staffan Lindberg. I'm a member of the EBA group, and we will start with showing everyone a very brief video on EBA.
Expertgruppen för biståndsanalys, EBA, är en statlig kommitté som oberoende analyserar och utvärderar svenskt internationellt bistånd för att det ska kunna förbättras och utvecklas. EBA har 10 ledamöter med kompetenser från olika biståndsområden och ett kansli som verkställer besluten. Förutom våra rapporter så ordnar vi seminarier, workshops och möten mellan olika parter. Varje år sammanfattar EBA sin verksamhet i årsberättelsen Biståndsanalys. Den kan beställas från kansliet eller laddas ner på eba.se. EBA har ett oberoende i relation till uppdragsgivaren regeringen, liksom i relation till vad som utvärderas, samt till de rapportförfattare som anlitas. Rapportförfattarna ansvarar själva för slutsatser och rekommendationer i sina studier. Allt vi producerar som rapporter, seminarier och vår podcast EBA-podden finns tillgängligt på vår hemsida. Expertgruppen för biståndsanalys.
Thank you very much. I hope that you all enjoyed that introduction to the Swedish language. But back to the topic of today, in these webinars, EBA want to create a platform to debate important questions within development cooperation. Today, we are launching the report Effects of Swedish and International Democracy Aid, authored by researchers at UNEU Wider, Miguel Nino, Rachel Gisselquist, Anna Horigoshi, Melissa Samarin, and Kunal Sen. Today's agenda is first we'll hear a brief presentation of the report that's been pre-recorded. We'll then have a panel discussion with the authors together with Swedish, well, we'll first hear from the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and what the findings tell them about their drive for democracy, and from SIDA, the Swedish International Development Agency, what their reaction is with regards to Swedish development cooperation. Then we will have a panel discussion with the authors. And at the end, we'll also take some questions from the audience. You are all invited to post your questions during the seminar in the Q&A function here in Zoom. And we'll pick some of them to discuss at the very end. There are some 500 people registered for the seminar, so I cannot guarantee that all questions will be answered, but we'll do our best. Okay. Thank you. So let's go straight to the meat of this, which is the report on effects of Swedish and international development aid. Please.
Hello. So I'm very pleased to introduce our report today. We'd like to thank the Expert Group for Aid Studies for the support of this study. And we'd also like to thank the members of the reference group led by Professor Staffan Lindberg, who provided incredibly helpful and generous advice on several iterations of this report. Turning to the next slide, I'd like to highlight 2 motivations for this study. So the first is that democracy aid is a significant component of development cooperation. Countries in the OECD Development Assistance Committee devoted roughly 10% of overseas development assistance to this area in recent years. And for some countries, the figure was higher. In Sweden, it was roughly a third. So it's certainly important to ask, does this aid work? And I think it's also fair to say that the evidence base has been a bit cloudy and contested, at least in some circles. Moreover, a key critique of foreign aid in general is that it is actually bad for democracy. So we have, for instance, Bill Easterly's critique that development experts have empowered dictators, and a body of research documents ways that aid may weaken local accountability, governance processes, and state institutions. Next slide. This topic is given new urgency by the fact that global democracy is in decline. Democracy has shown dramatic historical growth, as suggested in the figure here, which is based on data from the Varieties of Democracy Institute. But we see from the early 2000s that there have been concerning trends in democratic backsliding. The question, of course, is what can we, the international community, do? And among democracy promotion efforts, can we expect democracy aid, democracy assistance to help? Next slide. So this study then asks, does democracy assistance work? How does it work? Under what conditions? In what ways does it work best? And our simple answer here is yes. Our analysis points to a modest but positive impact on democracy. The impact of democracy assistance is clearer than the impact of development aid, but there's no evidence of a negative effect on democracy for either. Looking in terms of impact on democracy, aid that's targeted to support civil society, free and fair elections, media freedom, and human rights seems to work best. So how do we get here? Next slide. Our study has three core components. The first is a conceptual discussion and analytical framework, which is summarized in the diagram here. It speaks to the question, how should democracy assistance, in theory, support democracy? And in addition, what should we expect to see if democracy aid works in quantitative cross-country analyses? A couple of points to highlight briefly about this analytical framework. So for one, looking at the top of the three columns shown here, we distinguish between three broad camps of theory on democratization, three sets of explanations for why democratization occurs. The first set, structuralist theories, highlight how macro-structural factors like economic development and modernization contribute to democratization processes. The second, institutional theories, highlight the role of various institutions, both informal and formal, so political parties, for instance, or elections. And the third set, agency-based theories, highlight the role of individuals and leaders in democratic transition, survival, and consolidation. In addition, looking at the far left of the diagram and building here on work by Thomas Carruthers, we distinguish two overall approaches to democracy support. So first we have democracy aid, or what Carruthers refers to as political democracy aid, which is targeted at pro-democracy institutions and leaders. And the implicit and sometimes explicit approach here is broadly consistent, we argue, with institutional and agency-based theories of democratization. Then we have developmental aid, which supports democracy by pursuing incremental long-term change in a wide range of political and socioeconomic sectors. And the approach here is broadly consistent with structural theories of democratization. So building on this framework, our study considers the impact of democracy aid as an aggregate category, using both extensive and limited operationalizations of this term, subcomponents of democracy aid, so for instance, aid to elections or aid to political parties, and then developmental aid. Turning to the next slide, we see that the second component of our study is a systematic review of the quantitative literature on democracy aid and its impact. So systematic reviews involve following a clear, transparent, and reproducible method to first identify and then synthesize research. And they've been increasingly adopted in economics and other disciplines as a way to produce more rigorous and reliable syntheses of evidence than other literature review approaches. To our knowledge, this is the first systematic review on this topic. The table here provides an overview of the studies in our sample by aid type, indicating how many show that aid has positive, negative, or no effects on democracy. And to simply highlight one key finding here, as shown in the first two rows, the evidence from these studies points to democracy aid as being more clearly associated with positive impact on democracy than developmental aid. The studies also highlight some contradictory findings and some areas calling for more research attention. Next slide. The third component of our study builds on the first two and it's a new quantitative analysis of the impact of aid on democracy in 148 countries for the period 1995 to 2018, using multiple advanced econometric methods. And for this, we now turn to Miguel, who will discuss this component and key findings.
Thank you, Rachel. In the remaining time that we have, I will focus on the results of the international comparative analysis. Something that we have to say upfront is that a major challenge in multi-country, multi-year analysis of aid and democracy is what we call endogeneity problem, is particularly challenging, is how to disentangle the impact of aid on democracy from the influence of democracy and other factors on aid allocations. So we want to acknowledge that we are not in a position to prove causation, and that our results should be treated as approximations of a causal relationship. However, multiple models, methods, and approaches that have been tested in our analysis give us confidence about the results. Next slide, please. Before moving on to the results, I think some key definitions are pertinent. Next, please. In this study, we have focused on three main measures of democracy aid. One, as we define it, developmental aid, captures approaches of aid interventions that focus on broader activities such as education, health, and government and aid and civil society. Another approach is we focus on a definition of democracy aid that follows an extensive definition. This considers a set of activities that fall under the purpose classification code 150 of the OECD DAC code system, government and civil society organizations. And this definition has been used in the literature. While this definition captures important dimensions that are highlighted by the literature, in our opinion, it suffers from imprecision, as it includes activities that are not meant to strengthen democracy, for example, like police, fire and rescue services, and prisons, and so forth. Therefore, we focus on a third definition of democracy aid that we refer to as the limited definition of democracy aid. And this essentially is a set of activities that support key dimensions of democracy, as highlighted by institutionalist and agency-based theories of democracy, and which can be linked to the notion of political aid in Carothers' framework. We also use, in addition to these composite aid measures, key components of the limited definition of democracy to assess their contribution to democratic outcomes. For example, the link between aid to free and fair elections and BIDEM's Clean Election Index. Next, please. So in this slide, we can see the Swedish democracy aid following different definitions. We can see an upward trend in Sweden's democracy aid, for example, the limited definition, which is on the right-hand side of this slide. And we can see that the increase can be explained by a recent reconfiguration of aid allocations, consisting of an increase in non-country programmable aid, which is referred to here as unspecified bilateral. That includes, for example, administrative and research costs. And these are allocated to regional bodies, Sweden-based NGOs and international organizations. And also we observe a reduction of bilateral aid to core dimensions of democracy at country level, particularly in the areas of democracy participation and civil society and human rights, which you can see in colors blue and green on the same right-hand side chart. So this is you can see, for example, the different definitions can offer also a more clear analysis of the relationship between democracy aid and democracy. Next, please. Now, the next point is how we measure democracy. So democracy has been measured in a variety of ways in the literature. So in this study, we rely on a set of indices from the Varieties of Democracy Biden project. So our choice is based on a rigorous comparative analysis of democracy indices that we conducted, and which is presented in the appendix number 2 of the report. So we rely on the Electoral Democracy Index, which is an interval index on a scale between 0 and 1, which is made on an annual continuous indicators. So since democracy aid may impact specific components of democracy differently, this requires the composable measures of democracy, such as the Biden indices, and this is one of the reasons why we focus on this particular indicator. Next, please. So following the Biden's Electoral Democracy Index, we see the recent trends in the global average of the Electoral Democracy Index over the past 25 years show an upward trend from the mid-1990s up to the end of the first decade of the 2000s, when the index began to experience a marked decline. This is particularly clear among upper middle-income countries, as you can see in the left-hand side of the chart, and also among Latin American countries, countries in Europe and Central Asia. Please, the next one. So based on these descriptive indicators, we move on to the presentation of the results. So the first question that we set to answer is, does democracy and developmental aid contribute to democracy? So in order to answer this question, we implemented several econometric methods, models, and empirical specifications that capture this complex dynamic configuration of the relationship between democracy, aid, and democracy. In the next slide, we can see a summary of the results. And for more details, please, we invite you to read the report and also the appendix 3 and 4. So what do we find? So the results indicate that the contribution of international democracy aid to democracy is small, but positive and statistically significant. Just to give a perspective, so a 10 increase in international democracy aid using the limited definition over a 5-year period is associated with an average 0.14 points increase in the scale of the Electoral Democracy Index. And in the case of the Swedish aid, the size of the correlation is larger and statistically stronger. And this can be seen in this particular plot that we show here, which shows the markers for point estimates. So the spikes or the vertical lines show the confidence intervals at 90% levels. So those spikes crossing the reference line at 0 show coefficients that are significantly different from 0, in other words, significant. So as we can see, the point estimates that exhibit the largest size are for Swedish democracy aid using the limited definition. Next, please. So what does results mean? We describe the results giving some examples. For example, if we focus on the top 5 recipient countries of aid over the period 2013 and 18, which is the last period in which we have data for analysis, and we divide international democracy aid and Swedish democracy aid, we observe the top recipient countries, which are primarily electoral autocracies, which is defined as EA. In the third column, we see the average aid allocations in constant USA dollars in millions. The fourth column shows the average democracy score and the effect of the 10% increase in democracy aid based on our estimates. So this, as you can see, these are very small effects, but also we have to keep in mind that these are small effects from very low aid allocations. as you can see in the third column. So which shows that even small contributions to democratic institutions can have a significant or a meaningful effect on these institutions and actors. The next, please. In this slide, we show the impact of low or specific aid activities on lower level indices of democracy. So we find, again, positive contributions of most of the subcomponents of international aid on lower levels of democracy. These are, again, small effects from low levels of democracy assistance in those particular activities. Next, please. So the next question that we tried to answer was, does democracy aid support democratization upturns or help avoid the democratic backsliding downturns? So I think this question is important, given that electoral autocracies and fragile electoral democracies have figured most prominently as recipients of democracy aid over the past 25 years. Sweden's priority countries have experienced diverse democratic trajectories, some experiencing upturns, while others observing downturns. In the next slide, you can see the effect of democracy aid on democratization, and the results reveal an asymmetric relationship between democracy aid and the dynamics of political processes. Both contemporaneous and past democracy aid seems to be more effective at supporting democratization upturns, which is depicted on the left-hand right slide, than at preventing democratic backsliding or downturns. This is important, as you can see in the next slide, as the insignificant contribution of aid to stopping downturns reflect the fact that downturns are dominated by closed and electoral autocracies. So this is important because the power and resources that very often are available to political machineries that support these regimes can be very significant. So in this chart, we observe the countries with the most pronounced downturns in the scale of the Electoral Democracy Index since 1995. And you can see that these are primarily occurring among middle-income countries in Latin America, as we were mentioning before, also countries in Europe and in Central Asia. So this is important because these countries have been increasingly excluded from international Swedish democracy assistance because these countries have higher income status. So this is one of the challenges that donors face at the current time. Next slide and the next section is trying to answer the question, is democracy and developmental aid more effective at supporting democratization in democracies or autocracies? So this is important because it can guide pro-democratic policy strategies in their countries. So in the next slide, we summarize what we find in our analysis. So we adopt a method that accommodates Luhrmann's and colleagues' regime classification, which separates countries by closed autocracies, electoral democracies, and liberal democracies. So our analysis finds that the contribution of democracy is again positive and again small, and is much larger among electoral democracies. For example, in the case of Swedish aid, a 10% annual increase is associated with 12% increase in the probability of electoral democracies, such as Liberia, Bolivia, and Colombia, to remain in that particular political category. At the same time, the same amount of aid allocations to electoral autocracies or closed autocracies have a negative effect of these of the regimes to remain in that particular status, which is a positive thing, but the size of the effect is much more smaller. One of the things that also we observe is that these effects only become consistently positive or negative when the models control for factors that are related to, for example, the fiscal space of these countries, the level of state fragility, the presence of ethnic tensions, and the level of income inequality. So there are also some factors that also can be determinant in the effectiveness of these interventions or aid policies. So just to conclude, we want to just highlight the main findings of this study. In the next slide, we can see that overall the findings point to a small but positive contribution of international Swedish aid to support democracy as a political system around the world. Also, while our results indicate that aid from democratic donors, be it bilateral or multilateral, sustain democracy, the influence of emerging authoritarian donors remain unclear, and therefore this really underscores the need for future research on these particular donors. We don't find, and I think this is a very important finding, any evidence of a negative effect of democracy or developmental aid on democracy, as some studies have reported in the past. Next, please. Also, our findings show a stronger positive association when aid explicitly targets the building blocks of democracy via non-state actors that support civil society, free and fair elections, the free media, and human rights. In the case of Swedish aid, the results make a stronger case for increasing bilateral democracy aid to offset the drastic drops in funding to core dimensions of democracy seen in recent years. Further consideration should be given to the possibility of increasing aid to monitor and scrutinize electoral cycles and strengthen electoral bodies that support free and fair elections, which is an area that so far has received limited support. The next, please. Also, the results show that both international and Swedish aid appear to be more effective at supporting ongoing democratization upturns than at halting outgoing democratic backsliding downturns. Among upturns, there are both electoral democracies and electoral autocracies. So the question of whether to allocate scarce resources to support democratizing autocracies or advancing democracies, or both, require a very careful case-by-case consideration in light of the varying degrees of economic development, institutional capacity, and geopolitical significance among this group of countries. I think a more pressing question from a normative point of view is how to respond to backsliding countries, especially when those with the most pronounced losses in democratic freedoms are among middle-income countries of Latin America, Europe, and Central Asia that have experienced considerable cuts, as we were saying before, of developmental and democracy aid. So even if we consider several of these middle-income countries, these countries enjoyed not a long time ago spells of democratization before experiencing backsliding trends. For example, Turkey from 2000 to 2012, or Argentina in the 2000s. So you consider one of the extreme cases like Venezuela from the mid-1990s to 2002. So other countries such as Brazil, Croatia, South Africa, and Mexico have made important strides towards democracy in past decades, but have shown more recent signs of a rapid deterioration in the institutions and freedoms that uphold democratic practice. So this is one question that really requires some careful consideration. Next, please. An explicit interpretation of the results is that cutting democracy aid to countries that have not achieved democratic consolidation could adversely impact the state of democracy worldwide. And this is important in light of the recent global declines in democracy and the rise of authoritarian regimes. So just to conclude, I think the evidence make the case for continuing to provide democracy aid and possibly increasing it, especially in those core dimensions of democracy and where the results indicate that donors get the highest returns on their investment. And this is important because global democracy is in decline, and failure by the international community to respond can have major long-term consequences for international peace, stability, and prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation of the report. It's a very thorough report and with lots of things to be discussed. And I encourage everyone who is attending this webinar to please use the Q&A function to post your questions, and we'll try and address them towards the end of the webinar. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce the panel. We have Johannes Oljelund, Director General for International Development Cooperation, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Welcome. Birgitta Weber is the lead policy specialist on democracy and human rights at SIDA. Welcome. Torbjörn Pettersson is advisor to the Director General of SIDA, but most importantly for this purpose of this webinar, he recently returned from Ethiopia, where he was the ambassador of Sweden. And then we have two of the authors with us, Miguel Nino and Rachel Gisselquist. Miguel has a PhD in economics, and he's a development economist and non-resident senior research fellow at UNU Wider. And Rachel has a PhD in political science, and she's a senior research fellow also at UNU Wider. Welcome, everyone. And let me first ask Johannes Oljelund, Director General. Sweden now has a drive for democracy. It's a new foreign policy priority. How does the ministry view the results of the report in relation to the activities you are pursuing under the drive for democracy?
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for allowing me to say a few words. I'll start off by saying welcome to my kitchen. I'm where I am. I think we've all learned and tried over the years to make our participation in these kind of seminars as effective as possible. So I've stacked some books, placed my iPad on top of it, locked away the cat, but I also have 3 kids and a street sweep machine just pulled up outside the street, and I can't stop that. So if the sound is then protest, and I'll see what I can do. But that's where I am. We are in isolation. Had a case of COVID in the family. No problems for us, but we are staying away from people. It's true we have, and you've spoken to already, our drive for democracy. I think that it's an initiative that we launched about a year ago in an effort to counter the trend that you have identified and that is evident on democratic backsliding. Of course, as we entered this current crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, it quickly became very clear and tough, and you helped us spot that, and others pointed to it as well, that this would in itself be a challenge to our drive for democracy, but I mean more fundamentally to human rights and democracy and the rule of law. And we've seen this very clearly, how the working environment, civil society, and human rights defenders have deteriorated, and space for media has been closed and so on. And from us, we recognize that there's a limit to which this is understandable, and to which this is states are within their rights to restrict human rights under certain circumstances, and we should be clear on that. But at the same time, we thought, and we can see that it's in some places unproportional, and that it does not meet the requirements of legality and assessed proportionality. And therefore, we thought, even though we launched the Drive for Democracy before this crisis came upon us, and before we knew or before we saw the pandemic, we in a way thought the policy choice of the Drive for Democracy became extra strong, and for us, important for us would then be to contribute to a debate, and to also do what we can to provide support to civil society organizations, media, and also multilaterals to demonstrate that there are also forces that are watching this space. We thought that in itself was important to make it very clear that while we and others are, of course, in many ways preoccupied by the pandemic and the socioeconomic consequences and so on, and the medical consequences, of course, we thought it was also very important to make clear that we're watching the democratic space, the human rights space in this, and there is I sometimes use the word, there's a time for reckoning. I don't know if that's right. That's probably not the way to put it, but it must be made clear that this space is being watched. And I mean, now it's likely that we have begun our journey sort of out of this pandemic, at least in the medical sense. Vaccines are coming. We know it will take a long time, and we will, unfortunately, even though we try to act to not allow that to be the case, we know it will probably take longer time in our partner countries in the developing world. Very significant other resources have been made available, but it's not enough by far. But anyway, we have sort of begun this journey out of this pandemic. But regardless of this, we see and we expect the challenges to democracy and human rights to remain, of course. And this, as you have pointed to, Staffan and others, was a trend before. And unfortunately, I mean, it would be very interesting to see if there are opportunities in the crisis that we've been through and that we are in that also offer us sort of chances to make a bigger difference. But unfortunately, the expectation is that there are other forces as well that are holding us back and pushing democracy back. So from our perspective, it's I mean, we see the need to intensify and continue this push as best we can. And we do that from the perspective of, we have, Swedish Parliament has given us 2 targets for basically for our development aid, and that is to poverty eradiction and its freedom of oppression. And we think that from a development perspective, we associate the promotion of democracy and human rights with both these ideas, both with of course with values and with democracy and human rights issues, but also with poverty eradiction in and of itself, and that there is a relation between poverty and democracy and human rights, of course. SIDA has done fantastic work on these issues, and can probably speak more to it. But that's our rationale. It covers both the main targets that we have for our development aid, and democracy and human rights now is the largest thematic area of SIDA's work, and I know that you will speak to that, so I'll leave it at that. But it's also very significant and very present in our multilateral engagement, both from the ministry and the multilateral engagement that comes out of SIDA. So I think that our rationale is very clear. Our sort of political thinking around this makes sense for us. In the foreign ministry, there's also we see a correlation between all the policy areas of the foreign ministry. I mean, foreign security policy, development policy, and also aid policy, and that we can complement and support the different policy areas to make a strong package. So I don't think I have to I don't have to make a stronger case to this audience. I know that you most likely share our passion and interest for this. This said, the big question is how. The big question is how, and it it would be difficult for me to tell this audience how, but that's why it's so important for us to have the opportunity to listen to you and to read your report and to make sure that our development policy and our development action choices are based on sound research, and that we are criticized and helped in order to make our interventions as strong as possible.
Okay.
What I would add only is that, of course, it's difficult to isolate the development policy actions from development policy or foreign policy and the integration between these. And you looked at that in part, but you know, it doesn't make it any less important. It's very important for us to have your opinions on that. But I would just add the sort of more airy political intervention choices that we also work intensively with.
Thank you. And it's good to hear that you welcome critique, which not all governments of the world do. So on that, I also switched my background here to honor today's theme. This is Ghana and a polling station, not from the latest election the other day, but a couple of years ago. But this is obviously a possibility for democracy support. Now, let's turn to SIDA. Birgitta, how do you view the results in view of the democracy aid SIDA is engaged in, and any activities that SIDA support to civil society or other areas that you can reflect on?
Thank you, Staffan. Yes. Well, first of all, I would like to thank everybody who's been involved in this very robust and important study. I think the results are encouraging. I mean, from our point of view, it's fantastic to get evidence stating that democracy aid makes a difference and contributes to supporting democracy, even if it's small scale and even if the results differ depending on whether you use a narrow or a more extensive definition of democracy aid. And I hope we can come back to that, because although I think the findings are useful to SIDA in many ways, the distinction between a narrow and a more extensive democracy aid is also a bit problematic. But to start off from the point of view of the usefulness of the study, the findings taken as a whole provide very timely food for thought for us, input to a discussion we're having and will have on how to implement a new assignment from the government to further develop and strengthen SIDA's work on democracy as part of the drive for democracy that Johannes just told us about. Our approach to democracy is rather inclusive, and this assignment emphasizes both the developmental definition and the limited definition of democracy. And I hope we can come back to how the study could be of use to us more concretely. So SIDA's definition of democracy is wide, or democracy aid, I should say, is wide. We use the OECD DAC purpose codes for sector classification. The codes for this sector, or the code for this sector is not that great, but donors use it. They use the codes to report on their flows to DAC databases. Around 28% of our development cooperation is democracy aid, using this sector code, and 70% of that goes to geographic strategies, including regional strategies with regional programs, and 30% to global strategies with support to global actors and to which to a great extent also work in countries. There are lots of examples of SIDA-supported activities with positive results in countries where we're engaged. And The pandemic has changed the preconditions, of course, and our partners have adjusted their work, but I will not focus on that now. I'll give you some snapshots of what we do within these building blocks of democracy aid, to give you a feel for what it's about. In Burkina Faso, a SIDA-supported consortium of 15 CSOs has organized 11 national TV shows on citizens' dialogue, where those in power, the government representatives, that is, have been held accountable for fulfilling their obligations within their respective sectors, ultimately their obligations to fulfill human rights. And these dialogues have had great coverage in traditional and social media in the country. SIDA has provided electoral support in a number of countries to strengthen the capacity to hold free and fair elections. In Mozambique, for example, support has been provided to Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in Africa, EISA, to train civil society organizations in election observation and set up a platform for transparency, debate, and media well ahead of the election, and very useful then during the election. In Zimbabwe, support has been provided to civil society organizations to develop a proposal for a new election law, which has been presented to the parliament. In Turkey, SIDA supported an independent news agency, Bianet, that reports on violations of freedom of expression, including capacity strengthening of journalists. And this support has been increasingly important since this news agency is one of the few independent media outlets still active in Turkey. In Myanmar, support focusing on free, open, and secure internet has resulted in increased awareness of laws restricting freedom of expression, as well as advocacy against internet closure and the role of internet platforms in the escalation of violence against the Rohingyas. In Moldova, support to human rights defenders within the UN Human Rights Program has resulted in knowledge about and tools to claim human rights for Roma, persons with disabilities, and young offenders, for example, in the region of Transnistria. And lastly, an example from Guatemala that goes outside of the core elements of the narrow definition of democracy aid. There, SIDA has for many years supported the International Commission Against Impunity, CICIG, until its mandate ended last year. CICIG has worked together with the Attorney General's Office, and it's helped mapping and investigating networks of corruption and impunity to strengthen the capacity of criminal prosecution. It's been successful doing that and has contributed to a broader public understanding of the principle of the rule of law. And that's all from me for now.
All right. Thank you very much, Birgitta. So let me turn to the authors here. So we've heard some reactions, and that's Sweden from the ministry has a sort of dedicated effort in the drive for democracy, but and SIDA takes a very inclusive approach to democracy aid and following the OECD DAC definition. And what you find that it's rather the sort of more narrow or direct support to the core institutions of democracy that have the most effect in terms of promoting democracy. What's your reaction and advice here? Miguel, do you want to go first?
Yes, Stefan. Well, thank you very much, first of all, for the comments. I think that these are very important. Just making a reflection about the fact that the Swedish efforts via SIDA to support institutions, for example, anti-corruption entities, is I think is an important fact, and we certainly capture those kind of interventions through the extensive definition of democracy aid, because those activities are included in that particular category. No? However, one of the issues that we also have with that particular broader definition is that there are many other things there that not necessarily speak to democratic accountability. So that's why we decided to have a more narrow focus. And also because while state capacity can certainly support democracy, there are other factors as well that can be arguably support democracy, like, education. No? And then it becomes a much more complicated to actually find the links between these several complex linkages. And of course, we are not arguing against the support to the state capacity of countries. And I think this is something important, as well as we are not against SIDA supporting education or health. No, we are just simply saying that the evidence suggests that the support to the core activities that uphold democratic freedoms seems to have the greatest effect. No, and this is what the evidence is indicating.
Yeah, to some extent, for me as a democracy scholar, it's almost self-evident that if you support core institutions of democracy, you will have more effects on the level of democracy or extent of those rights than if you support something like a tax administration or something like that. But Birgitta, maybe you can say something about why SIDA views that this takes this broader view, and is there anything from this study that you think would give you at SIDA some reason to think about how democracy support is calibrated?
Yeah, sure. I started off by saying that the study is useful to us. It's useful to us in many ways, and one finding that I think could be of direct use to us is the finding that there was a steep decline in the allocations of democracy aid in the narrow sense from 2014 at country level. That's important information, and that can provide a point of departure for us in analyzing needs and gaps to fill on country level when operationalizing our strategies. And there are many strategies to be operationalized next year, for example. So that's useful. But then I'd like to come back to, democracy aid is obviously complex, and we do operate in a broader development cooperation framework, and our goal is both reducing poverty and oppression, and it's also highly political, highly normative, and evidence is extremely challenging using evidence, and it's complex. And here I would like to come back to the distinction again between the narrow and wide definition of democracy aid. You
said that was problematic. I was wondering about that.
Yeah, exactly. No, yes, I would like to come back to that. Certainly, I think most of my colleagues can see the point in leaving out some of the public administration support from a definition. Although from the perspective of the 2030 agenda and SDG 16, it is to us problematic to leave out the importance of transparent and accountable and inclusive institutions and the rule of law to development, which is, as I said, part of our framework, developmental framework. Especially problematic to leave out rule of law. For example, support to, the judicial sector, for example. And if I may refer back to the example from Guatemala. And at the same time, the narrow definition of democracy aid is also quite broad and extensive, since civil society support is very broad, and human rights support is broad. It includes not just civil and political rights, it also includes economic and social and cultural rights. And from a human rights point of view, it's the legal obligation of states to protect, respect, and fulfill human rights, which ultimately requires accountable institutions and the rule of law. And beyond the state, it requires regional and international human rights mechanisms, or institutions, if you want.
And I really want to bring in Torbjörn to the conversation as well. But I know, Johannes, you also want to come in, so I'll let you do that. Let me just, we should be honest and acknowledge, we know where the language in the SDG 16 came from when China and other countries came in and called their institutions accountable and removed the democracy language except for the preamble. You can have well-functioning institutions without having democracy or respect for human rights. We know that. Johannes, what are your reflections?
No, just very, very briefly, I said something, between the relation of the interventions that we can do, that SIDA is responsible for in country, and to the political dialogue that one also has, and the sort of political context. And I'm saying the obvious, but there is beyond measuring the exact impact of an intervention, there is a political context in which you act, and that might lead you to strategies that also it has to function in a political environment. So if you're able to then, let's say, support the tax authority, and you can do that with efficiency, and of course you have to avoid sort of stage capture and allowing it to be, or when you see it being used as an instrument of oppression and so on. But there is also a balance, circumstances in which you can engage in the support for the tax authority, as an example, and that can give you more space for other actions that are more in the tighter definition that you're using. I'm saying something that I think everyone knows, but since this is also a responsibility of the ministry in the strategies that we give to SIDA, I just wanted to make the point at that. Yeah,
and we'll hear the authors come back and reflect on that as well. As scholars, one thing is what you can see from the evidence, and then obviously that is divorced from political considerations that you have to take both at the ministry and at SIDA and at country level. And Torbjörn, this is something you wrestled with in the Horn of Africa for several years, and you're just back from there. And just to tie it in also to some of the questions we are receiving in the Q&A and before, this speaks also to a trade-off, right? Or a question, when should you be engaged and when shouldn't you be engaged? We see what's happening in Ethiopia today. Sweden is pulling out of Cambodia. We have given lots of broad democracy aid, if I put it that way, to places like Nicaragua and Tanzania, and it's still ongoing. But it doesn't seem to really have much of a effect on democracy in those countries. But with your vast experience from the ground here, can you reflect a little bit on this possibility of giving democracy aid and the political constraints and when you should not perhaps do it?
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry now to have to compete with the church bells of St. Matthias for another minute or so, because I got the question at 11 o'clock sharply. I'm sorry about that. I hope you can hear me over the church bells. First of all, thank you very much for the report. And I think, turning to your question, one very encouraging piece of evidence that you have is the huge opportunities in an upturn. And I think that's very important because when you enter into a transition, to paraphrase Lenin, it's democracy is not a tea party. So when you decide as a donor, as a government, as a country to go all in, so to say, to support a transition in Sudan and Ethiopia, you're very aware that the risk is very high, because you send many of attempts of transition, you know that it unleashes a lot of negative aspects as well. So I think the evidence you show that there are huge opportunities to capture, especially in upturns, is a very good, is very welcome, and I mean, it speaks maybe more to the political level that you need to take the risk to get engaged. Whereas if you see in other places, of course, on downturns and so, it might be futile to try to keep up because the effect is very low. So I think that's extremely useful in making that very, very difficult decision, because it relates not only to development efficiency and so, but also to political affairs more broadly. So that's my reflection on your question, and also on a very important view on that. But if I may just make two other remarks. I mean, I was, as you said, I came back after 3 years in Ethiopia, where I covered Ethiopia, of course, and which is a point in case when it comes to risk taking in a democratic transition. But I was also envoy to the African Union, and I think first a little bit of critique or risk with the way you've selected your criteria in the report. I was a bit surprised that you took out regional interventions from the kind of bilateral impact. Because if you look at what we, Sweden, and many other donors, but talking about Sweden, does to support the more narrative, the more limited concept, a lot of it is actually done on a continental level in Africa. So if by that you exclude very important support, I mean, unintentionally, of course, to human rights bodies, more or less independent, to election observation, to continental knowledge communities on democracy, and so, which I think, even though you can't, attribute it to a very specific country, actually means a lot to uphold the institutional capacity in all of the countries where we're working. So I think the regional cooperation, but it's partly technical, but it's also speak to my third and last point, which is also relating to what Johanna said, that it's difficult to measure the effects. And I realize you have to do that as a researcher because there has to be something tangible. But I think to see development cooperation effectiveness or effects in a bit of isolation is problematic, because our starting point is the global decline, and we have to do something. We use all tools we have. So I think that the way that development cooperation can contribute to the narrative, to the dialogue, to the competing narratives and our views is very important. The normative dialogue is difficult to measure, yes, but in the end, maybe that's where much of the struggle against the global decline has to happen. And that's partly because of what Birgitta talked about. I mean, the framework we are working in with development, but also, and that's more of a on the ground experience, in the resilience of democratic values, of democracy as a norm in Africa is, as I perceive it, weaker than in many other places of the world, because it's a fairly new phenomenon. 20 years ago, military coups was the normal way of changing power in Africa. And these institutions have less of historical resilience. And so I think that support to strengthen the institutions also through normative dialogue is very important. And lastly, I mean, going into that dialogue, one has to be to understand that the value of democracy, the norm of democracy, is more instrumental in many of these countries than we maybe would like to. That whether democracy is a good thing or not is more depending, does it deliver peace? Does it deliver poverty reduction? And we know there are competing narratives. So that's also something that I think speaks for having a bit of a broader approach to how we can support democratic actors and institutions in those countries.
Thank you, Torbjörn. Very insightful. But just let me point out that in some places in Africa, I think democratic norms are pretty strong. The place behind me, Ghana, who just held another round of successful elections, and Nana Akufo-Addo seems to have secured another 4-year terms. But it's there I find that the norms also among people are pretty strong, and I think that goes well with also evidence from Afrobarometer that a majority of people in Africa prefer to have democracy to other systems of government. But let me turn to
Miguel. I agree totally when it comes to the demand for democracy. The problem is the supply side, right? So.
Oh yes. But Miguel and Rachel, what do you say here about the critique that you didn't include the regional impact and the support that goes through regional organizations, and if that sort of qualifies your findings to some extent, and also if you have any further reflections on this with the issue of downturns? Yeah, Miguel, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. So, well, thank you, Torbjörn, for the comments. I think that these are important. One of the reasons why we didn't include regional support, you have to consider that we have 146 countries, and the information that we observe within these categories are quite fuzzy. So we don't have certainty about actually how these monies support countries that we are analyzing. So we are not in any way denying that regional or unclassified bilateral aid has an impact. So it's simply like the information doesn't give strong information to give us certainty and confidence to say that they have an impact. So certainly there may be very important activities that support democracy, let's say in Ethiopia, Ghana, or Liberia, but the extent to which those activities are at the African Union is very difficult to see how this impact domestic politics that we are looking at. And we say as well upfront in the report that what we observe are most likely lower bound estimates. In other words, it is very likely that the effects that we observe are underestimations of the actual effect that democracy can actually have in countries that we are looking at. But on a more rigorous way is very difficult to really unpack all these linkages. So that's why we decided to take these categories out of the analysis. So, but certainly this is something that we acknowledge, and this is a comparative analysis. This can be properly done if we have case studies, looking at, for example, the case of Ethiopia, and disentangle the contribution that the African Union and other international bodies have to democracy, and we haven't done that. So I think this is room for thoughts for future research.
And Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, if I can just add to that, I think the points are really well taken from the three of you, and I think that it's important to highlight that we're looking at demonstrable impact, right? So what is picked up at the national level in annual assessment of democracy, right? So as Miguel highlighted, these are, as I would think of them, sort of lower bound effects. And there's a lot more going on below that level that I think that we just aren't able to capture in this sort of analysis. And it's terrific to hear about more of it from your comments as well.
But Rachel, if I may ask you also, were you surprised by these findings about upturns and downturns, given also your experience studying these issues for a long time?
And I think broadly I guess my reading of the literature has been that democracy assistance is broadly supportive of democratic survival, right? So that's broadly consistent with the finding on support for upturns. Maybe it doesn't support consolidation, but it sort of supports staying in a positive way. So I found it broadly consistent with the literature. I wasn't surprised. We might hope that democracy aid would be more helpful in downturns, but it wasn't a surprising finding.
So let me throw that over to maybe both Birgitta and Torbjörn and also Johannes, if you'd like to comment. So as a scholar, I'm also not surprised by that finding. And we have a new comprehensive analysis coming out soon showing that of those countries that start a process of autocratization in democracies, 80% die, right? You have a survival rate of 20%. Then it should be no surprise that a little bit of democracy aid can't do much. But it also brings to my mind something that I was put on my radar, or sort of in my thinking first by a seminar organized by DIE in Germany and GIZ. And Julia Leininger say we need to focus on democracy protection rather than democracy support. And that requires different strategies. And we also have a number of questions in the Q&A that speaks to this issue. So in this world where we see democratic backsliding or autocratization in many countries, also in many developing countries or the global south, and do we need to rethink our strategies to implement other new strategies to protect democracy or the little rights that are there in a place like Tanzania, rather than sort of the traditional thinking of, oh, now we should support democracy to develop? Birgitta, Torbjörn, but start with you, Birgitta, and Johannes too, if you want.
Thank you, Staffan. I think to come back to the findings and how to be a bit practical, how they can be of use to us, and linking to the finding that democracy aid seems to be more effective in democratization context than in democratic backsliding context. I think it is important and possible to link this to flexibility, that donors need to be flexible. We have to get our political economy analysis right and act on it in an adaptive way. And I think the finding therefore seems to correspond well with the SIDA's and with how SIDA works and how the government has expressed its view in the new assignment to SIDA about the need for increased flexibility in our work on democracy. And yes, one important aspect of working in authoritarian or backsliding contexts is that our work can be about maintaining status quo and helping key actors to survive by supporting coping strategies. And I think that the example from Turkey, the news agency that I mentioned, could be considered an example of support to coping as one of many. I mean, there's so many contexts where we do support coping strategies of various actors.
But it's not like SIDA is now in a big discussion about how do we protect democracy rather than support in the traditional ways. I didn't hear that.
I think it's not that we're in a big discussion on it, but we are in a way, but it's linked to the various contexts. I mean, all contexts are different. So what my point is that it's extremely important for us to get better at power analysis, acting on our thorough power analysis, political economy analysis, context analysis, covering the situation in each country and have that thorough discussion there, in order to identify correct actions to deal with the needs and the challenges in each context. So yes, but I think this study can be a good injection for us to engage in a better overall discussion. And I also think that it would be great if we could have a presentation, or if we could present the study and discuss it in the OECD governance network with a wider international community. The governance network, which is the main forum for policymakers and practitioners in this thematic area, using the wider definition of democracy aid, though.
Yeah, I'm convinced that the authors will be happy to present it wherever they are invited. Johannes, what were your reflections on this?
I mean, my academic answer is, so what do you do? Give up? That's not an option. So we've done some work in the foreign ministry, and also in dialogue with SIDA and our embassies around exactly this. What do you do in when things go in the wrong direction, so to speak? And a big part of our answer is traditional. You come up with stronger support to civil society, media, allowing for interventions that are also outside of the country. I mean, you can take Belarus now as an example, where we're also supporting students who are outside of the country, and so on. And those are some of the things that you can do. But part of that paper also includes more sort of political choices. And how do you discuss it? How do you bring it to the attention of the other EU ambassadors? How do you raise it in the development ministers' meetings in Brussels and so on? So to make it to apply pressure there. But certainly, we welcome your research and tips and ideas, because it's very, very challenging. Even though I would say it has, I mean, if you take Cambodia as an example, where we're not seeing the positive effects that we're hoping for. But I would say it played a significant role that Sweden, brought this or forced this on the agenda in the wider EU discussion, as an example. And then you have effect. I mean, then you have the agreement on anything but arms and so on. So bringing other policy areas in as well.
Okay. So Miguel and Rachel, picking up on these issues, and based on your study, what would you say? Can it be used to say that you should pull out in certain contexts, or is your study not enough to say that? Or can you say something about specific countries? We have had a lot of questions in the Q&A about that too. Our places, and I brought it up a couple of times here with Tanzania, Nicaragua, are they places that it doesn't seem to work from your findings? Or are there any more general lessons here with regards to sort of preventing bad outcomes?
Well, again, I think the comments have been very useful. I think that our response is that our study provides a framework to think about these issues. Also offers methods to, for example, have a dashboard in a language that often officials use to monitor countries. So you can actually monitor the progress of countries towards or against democracy. And I think this is important because also allows you to act ex ante before democratic institutions collapse. And this is something that we observe in the data. To give you an example, Venezuela back in the 80s and 90s was the very few cases in Latin America that uphold democratic values. And the country just collapsed in a matter of 20 years in a way that no one imagined. with huge impacts on the well-being of many people in this country. And when you look at democratic support to Venezuela, it was basically absent, from most of the countries. So monitor the trajectory of institutions, I think, is very important, and the same happens in other countries like Turkey. So going back to the cases that we were discussing just a minute ago, and we also see, for example, a rather rapid deterioration of countries in Brazil, in Croatia, and many others, and the active response hasn't been observed actively. Another thing that came up, surprisingly to me at least, was the very little support to elections, to support electoral processes from SIDA and also from other countries, and especially thinking that electoral processes really are at the center of democratic values. And this is something that also was surprising to me. So this is one of the things that perhaps can be reconsidered. And but also, as I said, our study offers some tools for decision making, and perhaps doesn't spell out very clearly in the report, but certainly can give you some again, analytical tools for decision making.
Rachel, yes.
Yeah, I mean, so picking up on that, I think, basically what our report shows is sort of averages, right? So just because in general, aid is less helpful for backsliding countries, or, overall, democracy aid supports democracy, it doesn't mean it happens in every case. And so this is, so it's important to look at the specific cases specifically, and to think about the specific contexts. And I think our report, as Miguel was suggesting, lends some, can help with that a bit. I mean, there's things that we control for in the analysis, for instance, that help to predict whether, help to predict the impact of aid, right? So I guess that's one point. I guess the other thing here is maybe our report also points to some areas where we can think about quicker wins for aid in terms of demonstrable democratic impact. So that's sort of another direction that the findings can push here. But yeah, let me stop there.
Oh, but let me hear you maybe both, but on the absence of a negative finding, if I put it that way, that may go a little bit unnoticed, I fear, but I think in light of the academic literature that we know, I think it's significant. And we've also received a few comments in the Q&A speaking about things like supporting institutions of the state over maybe decades, as Sweden has done in a number of countries, and strengthening them, and then they are being used by authoritarian leaders to further control society. And there is a vast academic literature on this, suggesting that the new type of competitive authoritarianism in the world sort of solidify their power by the use of institutions such as the judiciary, such as the parliaments, and so on. And in light of that fear from many and the academic literature, you find that there are no negative effects, at least. So that speaks against that. So can you talk a little bit about that finding? Rachel or Miguel? Yeah.
Yes. Let me start by just saying that we are not obviously in a position to say that in certain contexts this may happen. So obviously our analysis look at the mean of 146 countries. One of the reasons why we think that this is in a way mitigated, or these risks are mitigated, is that a substantial amount of democracy aid, in the way we defined it, is channeled through civil society organizations and other bodies that support pro-democratic actors and institutions. So just about 2% is channeled through budget support, which in a way could be subject to state capture. This is one of the things that are likely to mitigate the risk of using these resources in favor of the incumbents. But obviously, I think the point that you are saying, Stefan, is very important, because also the way aid is focused really matters. No, just reflecting upon the last weeks, what happened in the US, it's so important to support institutions that uphold the check and balances of electoral processes, and very often those check and balances are not mature enough to counterbalance the power of dictators or leaders in many countries. And this is where aid can more effectively be channeled, whether it is within the state, via specific activities or policies that can prevent state capture. But the idea is to create these check and balances is incredibly important.
Did you want to add something, Rachel?
Yeah, just, I think for those of us who follow the aid literature, there's a really big argument there. There's a lot of sort of knee-jerk skepticism of aid, that aid is dead and aid is bad for democratic governance. And we do see that certainly in some countries. The way that aid is delivered maybe isn't very supportive of local accountability and so on. And there's been support by aid to undemocratic leaders. So I think it's an important critique to look at seriously. And I guess the main finding here is that we should be more cautious with that. Yes, this is a real concern, but overall, aid is associated with positive democratic outcomes.
I think that's great news. And we only have a couple of minutes left. So I will ask Birgitta, Torbjörn, and Johannes if you have any final comments, to keep it very short, 30 seconds or less, as a final reflection. Birgitta.
I just want to comment on another finding that could be of direct use to us, and that's the finding on time perspective, that democracy aid defined narrowly correlates more strongly with democracy in the short to medium term, and democracy aid in the wider sense correlates to democracy in more long-term institutional development, which we've been talking about just now. And this could provide a good point of departure on how we need to sequence and prioritize our support at country level, especially in times of rapid political change in relation to democratization and democratic backsliding, depending on context.
Okay, thank you. Torbjörn, do you have any final 30 seconds?
Sorry, nothing new, but just to repeat, we talked about the downturn, that's important. I feel much of the debate is on the downturn, but I think again, as I said, go all in when you have an opportunity. That's we've been slow in post-conflict situations, and so it's risky, it's difficult, but I think the support is there, that the impact is there's quite strong evidence on the impact of taking that risk.
So pick your few cases and go in all.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. Johannes, what do you say about that?
Well, most of all, I just want to say thank you for today's seminar. But even more than that, thank you for the research. Very helpful for us. I think that politically we have there are no alternatives to trying to be active in this area. The commitment to that is very strong. It is, it is risk related, but we really don't have a choice or want to abandon efforts in this area. So your research and your help in guiding us on what works and how we should do it is invaluable, really. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all the authors of the study. Thanks to the panelists. Thank you to you all who have attended this seminar via Zoom or other means. We try to answer some of the questions after the seminar, promise you. All EBA webinars can be viewed on the EBA homepage, www.eba.se. There are also links to other podcasts and so on that EBA produce. Thank you, everyone. Again, thanks especially to the authors for this very important study that I'm sure will be noticed, used, and discussed widely in the international community. Thank you so much.